Millionaire marries his secretary out of revenge, and the reason shocks everyone. Before we begin, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more life-changing stories like this one. Enjoyed the story? Richard Montgomery's fingers rested against the cool glass of his penthouse office window as he gazed out at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The city was alive, bustling with the energy of millions of people chasing their dreams. Yet, to Richard, it all felt insignificant. His life had once been filled with vibrancy, ambition, and a sense of purpose. Now, it was only a cold reflection of his ambition, which had grown into something darker and more consuming. His empire was impressive, his wealth immense. But his soul felt barren. The memories of his childhood haunted him with a clarity that had only grown sharper as the years passed. Richard was born into a world of privilege, where every wish was granted with a snap of his fingers. His father, a powerful businessman who controlled vast sectors of the financial world, had been his hero. His mother, Anne Montgomery, was his muse, elegant, beautiful, the picture of perfection. Or so he had thought. He could still remember the day his life was shattered. He had come home from school to find his father pacing in his study, his face flushed with frustration and grief. Richard had knocked on the door, but his father hadn't answered, too consumed by the storm brewing inside him. It wasn't until later that night that the truth came out. His mother, his beloved mother, had been having an affair with Samuel Walker, his father's closest friend, a man Richard had trusted more than anyone. Samuel Walker was more than a business partner, he was family. Richard had looked up to him, respected him. But now, everything he had known was tainted. The affair had not only broken his father's heart, but had caused the collapse of their family's business empire. His mother's betrayal had irreparably destroyed the trust that held their world together. The weight of this betrayal followed Richard through his adolescence, a bitter reminder that the people he had trusted most were capable of the deepest wounds. He could still remember the empty look in his mother's eyes when she tried to apologize, her words hollow and insincere. The damage was done. Richard's life had never been the same. His father never recovered from the heartbreak. Despite their immense wealth, the family crumbled. Samuel Walker had not only taken his mother's heart but had also taken their family's legacy, using his influence to siphon away the business Richard's father had built from the ground up. The Montgomery name, once a symbol of power, had been reduced to a hushed whisper in the business world. Richard's anger had consumed him during his youth, a dark fire that burned every time he thought about Samuel Walker, his mother, and the life he could have had. As he grew older and his career flourished, he vowed one thing: he would make them all pay. His father had died in disgrace, broken and forgotten. His mother had never truly understood the weight of what she had done. Samuel Walker had grown old, rich, and untouchable. But Richard would not let them rest. He would find a way to make them feel the same pain he had endured. The pieces of his plan had come together gradually, each one falling into place like a well-executed strategy. And it all hinged on Barbara Walker. Barbara was everything Richard despised. She was the daughter of the woman who had destroyed his family, but more than that, she was innocent in ways Richard had never been. She had no idea of the connection between her mother and the destruction of his world. Barbara worked for him as his personal assistant, a quiet presence in his high-powered company. She had a sharp mind, a calm demeanor, and an uncanny ability to anticipate his every need, but to Richard, she was nothing more than a tool. She would help him enact his revenge. Barbara's beauty was understated, yet captivating. She wasn't one of those women who paraded her allure. It was subtle, more of an energy than a feature. She didn't flaunt her charms, but Richard couldn't help but notice them. Her soft blonde hair, her bright, inquisitive eyes, and the graceful way she moved, it was all too perfect, too innocent. She reminded him of the purity he had once known, before everything had been stained with betrayal. That purity made her the ideal person to manipulate, to use, and to hurt. Richard knew that Barbara had no idea of the connection between her mother and his father. To her, Samuel Walker was just a business associate, a distant figure in the world of wealth and power. She didn't know that her mother had torn apart the fabric of Richard's family. And that was exactly what Richard intended to use to his advantage. He would charm her, seduce her, and ultimately make her fall in love with him. Then, he would crush her, just as his family had been crushed. But as he sat there in his office, Richard couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. There was something about Barbara, something that made his plan more complicated than it should have been. His emotions, carefully buried for years, were stirring in ways that unsettled him. Was he truly capable of this level of manipulation? Could he truly destroy the woman who reminded him so much of the life he had lost? Or was he starting to see something in her that could be more than just a pawn in his game of vengeance? Richard closed his eyes, pushing aside the thoughts that threatened to cloud his judgment. He had a plan, and he would not let anything, least of all his own emotions, stand in his way. Barbara Walker would be his key to revenge. He would make her fall in love with him, and then he would destroy her, just as her mother had destroyed his world. And in that destruction, he would find the peace he had been searching for his entire life. The storm of his emotions raged within him, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to stay focused. This was no longer about right or wrong. This was about justice. And no matter the cost, he would have it. Richard stood up from his chair, feeling the need to walk around to dissipate the growing tension in his chest. He couldn't afford to let doubt take hold of his mind now, not after so many years of planning. His life had been defined by losses and betrayals, and revenge was the only thing that had kept him going, that had given him a sense of purpose. The scars of his past were deep, but they had forged him into the man he was today, ruthless, calculating, and driven by the need to make those who had wronged him pay. As he walked across the polished floor of his office, his gaze flicked to the sleek, modern clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. The city outside seemed to pulse with an energy that felt almost foreign to him now. He had everything anyone could want: wealth, power, control, but it had all come at a price. No amount of luxury could fill the void left by betrayal. No amount of money could erase the images of his father's broken heart, of his mother's hollow apologies, of the gaping wound left in the wake of the Walker affair. And yet, he had never felt more alone. The plan was simple, he told himself. Barbara Walker would fall into his grasp, and her heart would be the weapon he needed to destroy her mother. He would show her a love that was as fake as the world her mother had created. But somewhere, deep inside, Richard feared the lines between vengeance and desire might blur in ways he hadn't yet considered. It was a Friday afternoon when Richard first decided to put his plan into motion. For weeks, he had been observing Barbara Walker, noticing every little detail that made her both the perfect target and a terrifying complication. The way she moved through the office with a quiet grace, the ease with which she navigated the business world without ever drawing attention to herself. Richard admired her intelligence, but it also irritated him. She was too competent, too unassuming. His instinct was to always control, to manipulate, yet Barbara resisted any attempt to do so. At least on the surface. Richard couldn't deny the attraction he felt for her. There was something about her that stirred his cold heart, something that made him wonder whether he was truly capable of using her as a pawn. She wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of the woman who had destroyed his life, and yet Barbara didn't know the half of it. She didn't know the hatred he harbored for her mother, for the choices that had set everything in motion. Barbara wasn't to blame for her mother's actions, but that didn't matter. To Richard, she was still a reminder of the betrayal that had marred his entire existence. For now, though, he had a task to accomplish. He needed to get Barbara to trust him, to lean on him. He needed her to believe he cared, even if he didn't. The act of manipulation was always delicate, especially when it came to emotions. And for someone as intelligent as Barbara, it wouldn't be enough to just charm her with smiles and empty words. No, he had to be subtle, patient. Every step needed to be carefully measured, every word weighed. "Barbara!" Richard called from his desk as she passed by his office, her heels clicking softly on the polished floors. Barbara stopped in her tracks and turned toward him, her expression neutral. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery?" Her voice was always calm, almost too calm, as if she were holding back something, an opinion, a desire, perhaps even a sense of knowing. Richard couldn't tell. But today, he would push her a little further than usual. I was hoping you could stay late tonight. I need some assistance with an important project I'm working on, Richard said smoothly, his tone polite but firmed out. Barbara's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't hesitate. Of course, I'll make sure to clear my schedule. Richard couldn't help but notice the way her lips curled slightly as she agreed to his request. It was the first time she had agreed to something so willingly. Maybe she trusted him more than he had initially thought, or perhaps she simply saw it as another routine task. Either way, he knew this was a small victory. As the clock ticked closer to the evening hours, Richard's anticipation grew. He knew Barbara would show up on time. She always did, always dependable, always professional. But there was more at stake here than a simple work assignment. This was the beginning of a much bigger plan. He had to ensure that when the time came, she would be ready to play her part. When Barbara walked into his office, it was as if the world around Richard shifted. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her figure framed by the light from the hallway. She looked beautiful, beautiful in the way that felt almost too innocent for the game he was about to play. He had to keep his focus. There was no room for emotions here, only strategy. Thank you for staying late, Richard said, his voice betraying no hint of the emotions swirling inside him. Barbara nodded and took a seat at the table across from him, her posture as composed as ever. Of course. What exactly do you need help with? Richard had prepared for this moment. He had decided to ease into the conversation, making it about business first. He slid a file across the table towards her. I need you to go through these reports. There are some discrepancies I need to address. I want you to look for any irregularities, anything that seems off. I trust your judgment. Barbara opened the file, flipping through the pages with methodical precision. She was sharp, quick, and above all, focused. As she studied the documents, Richard watched her, noting how she seemed completely absorbed in her work, oblivious to the weight of the situation. He admired her dedication, but it also reminded him of the distance that had always existed between them. They had never shared anything personal. She was always professional, always a perfect assistant. It made his job easier, but also more difficult. After several minutes of silence, Barbara looked up from the file, her brows slightly furrowed in concentration. I've found a few irregularities, but nothing that seems out of the ordinary for this quarter. I'll need to dig deeper to be sure. Richard nodded, his mind already racing with how to use this moment to further his plans. I trust you, Barbara. That's why I've asked you to handle this. I know you'll get to the bottom of it. Barbara offered a small smile, clearly pleased with the praise. Richard had always admired how much she thrived on validation, but now it was time to shift the conversation, to move it into more dangerous waters. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking with hers. There's another matter I wanted to discuss with you. Something personal. Barbara's eyes widened slightly, a faint flicker of curiosity dancing in her expression. Personal? Yes, Richard said, his voice steady, but with a hint of warmth. I know we've never really had the chance to talk outside of work. And I think it's important for us to get to know each other better. You're more than just my assistant, Barbara. You're someone I trust, and I think it's time we start building something more. Barbara blinked in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed intrigued, her professional composure slipping just slightly. What do you mean? Richard smiled, but it was a smile of calculated charm, the kind that he knew would make her believe in the sincerity of his words. I'm talking about more than just work. I've been thinking lately about how we could collaborate. Maybe even outside of the office. I'm not asking for anything immediate, but I do think it could be worth exploring. What do you think? Barbara hesitated, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the file in front of her. I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Montgomery. But I appreciate the offer. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her, knowing full well that the seed had been planted. She hadn't rejected him outright, she had only hesitated, which was a sign of interest. He could work with that. He could work with her. Think about it, he said, his voice low and enticing. "I believe we could be of great benefit to each other. Let's see where this could go." As Barbara left the office that night, Richard felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him. He had taken the first step in what would become a long and intricate game. Barbara was still unaware of her place in it, but she would soon learn. In time, she would fall into his trap. And when she did, it wouldn't just be her heart he would break, it would be the heart of the woman who had ruined his life. But for now, Richard could only smile to himself, knowing that the first move had been made. The following days unfolded like a slow-moving storm in Richard's life. The weather outside seemed to mirror his internal turmoil: gray skies, distant thunder, and heavy, unrelenting rain. As Richard sat in his office, the cold reflection of the rainwater on his windows felt like a fitting metaphor for his emotions. His plan was in motion, but it felt less like the calculated strategy he had envisioned and more like a dangerous game where the stakes were rising every minute. Barbara had become an enigma to him. The more he interacted with her, the more he realized how difficult it would be to control her. She was sharp, perceptive, something Richard had never fully expected. But there was a beauty in that challenge. As much as he resented the idea of having to work harder to manipulate her, there was also a certain admiration for her intelligence. She was different from the other women he had seduced over the years. She didn't respond to the usual tactics of charm and calculated affection. She was more reserved, less susceptible to his games, and that made her a more intriguing target. Richard had always been accustomed to getting what he wanted, and Barbara's resistance only ignited his determination. He was playing a long game, a game of patience. Barbara would not be so easily swayed, and that was the exact reason he needed her to fall for him, because he could break her, and in doing so, he would finally avenge the betrayal that had shaped his entire existence. His strategy now was simple: let her come to him, at least emotionally. If he pushed too hard, he might scare her away. Instead, he needed to make her feel safe, make her believe that she was the one in control, when, in reality, it was he who held all the power. He had to keep her on her toes, make her feel as though their connection was evolving naturally, without pressure. It was a delicate balance, and Richard wasn't sure if he could pull it off. He sat back in his chair, reviewing the notes he had made over the last few days. He had observed Barbara carefully, her body language, her subtle shifts in mood, the way she interacted with him and with others in the office. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't warm either. There was something about her that seemed to always keep her at a distance, as if she were hiding a part of herself from the world. Richard had long since stopped pretending to be indifferent to her presence. He had allowed himself to admit that there was something magnetic about her, something that made him want to push her further, to see just how far he could go. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw Barbara's name. "Mr. Montgomery, I wanted to ask if we could meet to discuss the reports from last week." Her voice came through the phone with its usual calmness. It was professional, but also just the slightest bit warmer than usual, a nuance Richard didn't miss. Was she opening up to him, or was she simply being polite? Either way, he saw it as an opportunity to push her closer to him. "Of course," Richard replied, his voice smooth, giving nothing away. "Why don't you come up to my office in an hour? We can go through the details together." "Sounds good. I'll be there soon." Barbara was punctual, as always. Richard had come to expect that from her. She arrived precisely an hour later, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, soft yet purposeful. She knocked once before entering his office, her hands neatly folded in front of her. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, offering him a polite nod. There was something different in her eyes today, something guarded. Richard wasn't sure whether it was his imagination, or whether she was sensing something was off. But there was a subtle shift in the way she was carrying herself, and it intrigued him. "Please have a seat, Barbara." Richard gestured to the chair opposite him, trying to keep his voice casual, but there was an undercurrent of intent behind his words. "I was reviewing the reports again, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on a few points." Barbara sat down, her movements as fluid and graceful as ever. She opened the file in front of her and began to sift through the pages. As she did, Richard studied her closely, noting the way she ran her fingers along the edges of the papers, the faint furrow of her brow as she analyzed the data. She was incredibly sharp, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for Richard to read her. She didn't react to his attempts to charm her, and that only made her more irresistible in his eyes. "I noticed a few discrepancies," Barbara said, her voice steady as she turned the page. "But nothing that couldn't be explained. The numbers in question seem to align with projections from last quarter. However, I'll look into it more if you want a more thorough analysis." Richard nodded, his gaze never leaving her. "No need for further analysis just yet. I trust your judgment, Barbara. I just wanted to make sure we're not missing anything that could affect the company." She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his with a directness that made him pause for a split second. There was something unsettling about how easily she saw through his act, how much she understood without him saying a word. It was both refreshing and infuriating. "You've always been so meticulous with the business," she said thoughtfully, breaking the silence. "But I've noticed you don't often talk about anything outside of work. It's almost like your world is defined by numbers and reports. Don't you think you're missing out on life?" Richard's pulse quickened, the directness of her statement catching him off guard. She was probing, maybe even testing him. Was she trying to break through the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself? "I believe in focusing on what matters," Richard replied evenly, maintaining his composed facade. "And right now, what matters is ensuring the company thrives." Barbara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read him. Richard could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as if she could peel away his layers and see into the heart of his carefully guarded secrets. But that was impossible, wasn't it? No one could ever truly know him, not like she thought she could. He would never let anyone in, not completely. "I suppose that's one way to live," she said finally, her tone softening just a little. "But I think there's more to life than business, Richard. You seem like someone who's always in control, but maybe you don't realize how much you've been letting slip through your fingers." For a brief moment, Richard's heart raced. How could she possibly know that? How could she understand the internal battles he was fighting every day? But he quickly dismissed the thought, brushing it off as just another one of her probing attempts. She was still just an assistant, still a pawn in his game, whether she realized it or not. "Perhaps," he said coldly, standing up from his chair and walking towards the window. "But that's how I choose to live. And it's worked for me so far." He turned back toward her, his gaze unwavering. "Now I think it's time to focus on what really matters." Barbara didn't say anything else. She simply nodded and stood, collecting her things. There was a tension between them now, something unspoken but palpable. Richard couldn't help but wonder if Barbara was finally beginning to see the cracks in his armor. As she left his office, Richard felt the weight of her words lingering in the air, but he pushed them aside. He had a job to do. The game was far from over, and if anything, it was just beginning. The days following their last encounter felt like a careful dance for Richard. He had come to realize that Barbara was not the type of woman he was used to. She wasn't swayed by charm, and she didn't wear her emotions on her sleeve. It was as though she was watching him, waiting for the moment when his carefully crafted persona would slip. He could feel her growing suspicion, but Richard had always prided himself on being patient. He had all the time in the world to make her fall into the trap he had laid for her. After all, revenge was a dish best served cold, and Richard was nothing if not methodical. But despite his calculated approach, he couldn't help but notice that Barbara was getting under his skin in ways he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just his target anymore. There was a part of him that felt a strange pull toward her, a magnetic force that he couldn't explain. She wasn't the kind of woman who gave in easily, and that made him want her more. The mere thought of her intrigued him, frustrated him, and ignited something inside him that he had long buried. Richard had spent the last few days pretending to be busy with work, maintaining the same professional distance between them. He made sure their interactions were brief and to the point. The less he revealed about himself, the better. But he couldn't deny the tension that simmered just below the surface. He had put the plan in motion, and now, all he needed to do was wait for Barbara to fall into his orbit point one afternoon. As Richard was leaving his office for a meeting with an important client, he saw her. She was standing by the elevator, talking to one of the junior staff members, her posture perfect, her voice calm but authoritative. As she spoke, Richard couldn't help but notice the way her eyes lit up with passion when she discussed the details of a new project. There was something about her that made her seem almost untouchable. He could tell that she was incredibly good at what she did, but it was also apparent that she was always in control. That control was something Richard coveted. The moment Barbara saw him, she excused herself from the conversation and walked toward him. As always, her movements were graceful, deliberate. She smiled, but there was a coolness to her expression that kept him at arm's length. "Mr. Montgomery, I was hoping we could talk about a few things before you leave for your meeting," she said, her tone professional yet with a hint of something else beneath the surface. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden request. "Of course, Barbara. What's on your mind?" "I've been reviewing the financial reports for the last quarter, and I think there are some discrepancies that need to be addressed immediately. I've made a list of potential risks that we might face if we don't take action soon. I think it would be prudent to discuss them before they escalate." Richard nodded, his mind racing. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. "I see. Let's go over it quickly. We don't have much time, but I'll make sure we address it before the meeting." They walked to his office, and as they entered, Richard could feel the familiar tension between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air. Barbara was meticulous in the way she laid out the reports, pointing out potential flaws, risks, and areas of concern. Her attention to detail was impressive, and Richard couldn't help but feel a small sense of admiration for her expertise. She wasn't just his secretary anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. As they continued to go over the reports, Richard found himself paying more attention to the way she spoke, the way she organized her thoughts, the way her eyes moved as she read through the numbers. There was a fire in her that he hadn't seen before. But it was also clear that Barbara was playing a game of her own. She was far more perceptive than he had initially given her credit for. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, pausing as she looked up from the reports. "Are you sure you're not missing something?" Richard's breath caught for a brief moment. Was she sensing something? Was she getting too close to the truth? He quickly masked his reaction with a calm smile. "Barbara, I assure you, I've been through the reports with a fine-tooth comb," Richard replied, leaning back in his chair, keeping his posture confident. "But I appreciate your thoroughness. It's what makes you an asset to this company." Barbara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded her arms and regarded him with a cool, calculating gaze. "I think there's more to this than you're letting on. If we don't address these issues now, it could jeopardize everything. And I'm not sure if you realize just how serious this situation is." Richard's mind raced. She was so close to the truth. But he couldn't let her know that. Not yet. Not until he was ready to reveal his cards. "I'll take care of it, Barbara. Don't worry. You've done a good job," Richard said, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm sure it's just a minor issue. I'll handle it." Barbara didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press the matter any further. She gathered the reports and stood up, ready to leave. "All right, Mr. Montgomery. But I still think we need to keep a close eye on this. Don't let it slip through the cracks," she said, her voice firm. Richard nodded, watching her as she walked toward the door. "I won't. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." As the door closed behind her, Richard exhaled slowly. That had been close. Too close. He knew that Barbara was becoming more and more aware of his behavior, and that made him uncomfortable. She was sharp, perceptive, traits that made her a perfect ally in any other situation, but in his plan, those very qualities could prove to be his undoing. The next few days passed in a blur for Richard. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Barbara, of the way she seemed to be getting under his skin. He couldn't let her distract him. His goal was simple: make her trust him, make her fall for him, and then use her to destroy the one person who had ruined his life, her mother. But Richard had learned an important lesson in the last few days. Barbara wasn't someone who could be controlled easily. She was independent, intelligent, and far more perceptive than he had anticipated. It was clear now that she was starting to sense something was wrong. She was beginning to piece together the puzzle in a way that Richard hadn't expected. That night, as Richard sat in his penthouse apartment, staring out over the city skyline, he felt a shift inside himself. The game had changed. What had once been a simple plan for revenge had now become something far more complicated. He couldn't afford to underestimate Barbara again, and yet, despite the challenges ahead, Richard couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. He was more determined than ever to see his plan through to the end. The stakes had never been higher, but that only made the game more thrilling. After all, Richard Montgomery was no stranger to danger. And when it came to Barbara, he was willing to take the risks. The days following the unsettling encounter in his office felt like an internal battle for Richard. The meticulous plans he had laid out for Barbara seemed to be unraveling just slightly, slipping through his fingers in ways he couldn't quite control. He had long believed that he was a master at reading people, a strategist who could bend anyone to his will with the right combination of charm and calculated distance. But Barbara was different. She was unpredictable, sharp, and most importantly, aware of the subtle power games he was playing. Richard paced around his penthouse apartment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like the relentless rain outside. It had been 3 weeks since he had initiated his plan to use Barbara as a pawn in his revenge against her mother, but now, everything felt more complicated. Every conversation, every interaction, was becoming a test, one where he wasn't sure if he was in control anymore. Barbara had grown more distant, more watchful, and yet, at times, there was a softness in her demeanor that confounded him. One evening, as Richard prepared for another round of board meetings, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, noticing Barbara's name. Despite the tension in their recent exchanges, he always responded to her quickly. After all, she was part of the plan, whether she knew it or not. "Mr. Montgomery, I have completed the financial projections you requested. I believe it's time to discuss the next steps regarding the project. Are you available to meet tomorrow afternoon?" Richard read the message several times. Barbara's efficiency and professionalism were remarkable. She had done exactly what he had asked of her, and in some ways, it both impressed and irked him. She was too competent for her own good. But her intelligence could also serve him if he played his cards right. He quickly typed a response. "I'm available at 2 p.m. tomorrow. I'll have my assistant schedule the meeting. Thank you for your diligence, Barbara." Her response came swiftly. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. I'll see you then." He set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, a sense of unease creeping over him. Barbara wasn't just a secretary to him anymore. She was becoming something more, something he hadn't planned for. His desire for control was slipping away. He couldn't allow that to happen. He needed to regain his footing, needed to remind himself why he had started this game in the first place. His obsession with avenging his father's betrayal, with punishing the woman who had ruined his life, needed to stay his focus. The next afternoon, Barbara arrived at his office, her usual poise and grace on full display. She knocked gently on his door before entering, the soft click of her heels echoing in the otherwise quiet space. As always, Richard couldn't help but notice the subtle elegance in her every movement. There was something magnetic about her, an intensity that couldn't be ignored. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of something else. It was as if she were waiting for him to speak first, to offer something more than the cold, professional exterior that he had been maintaining. "Barbara," Richard said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. "Please have a seat. I've been looking over the projections you sent me. Excellent work." She nodded but didn't sit immediately. Instead, she glanced at him with a knowing look, as if she were searching for something beneath his words. "Thank you," she said. "But I'd like to talk about something more than the projections, if I may." Richard's brow furrowed. He had prepared for a business discussion, not for something that could potentially derail his carefully orchestrated plans. Go ahead, he said, keeping his voice even, his body language relaxed. It was a practiced calmness, one he had perfected over the years. Barbara stood there for a moment, hesitating, as though weighing her words carefully. She finally sat down, her posture straight and unwavering, yet there was a certain vulnerability in her eyes, a glimmer of something that made Richard's stomach tighten. "I've been thinking about our discussions lately," she began, her tone more introspective than usual. "I'm not sure if you're aware, but I get the feeling you're holding something back from me, Mr. Montgomery." Richard's heart skipped a beat. Was she onto him? Did she know about his true intentions? "Barbara, I'm not sure what you mean," Richard said, his voice cool and controlled. "I've been as open as possible with you." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and studied him closely. "It's not what you're saying, Richard. It's what you're not saying. I've been with this company for a while now, and I've never seen someone so guarded, so controlled. There's always been something hidden beneath the surface with you, and I can't shake the feeling that it's more than just business." Richard felt a chill run down his spine, but he masked it with a tight smile. "You're imagining things. I assure you, my focus is solely on the company. Nothing more, nothing less." Barbara's eyes flickered for a brief moment. "Is that really the case, though?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "You've been distant with me lately, and while I don't mind the space, I can't help but wonder why. Is it because of something I said or did?" Richard's mind raced. This was not part of the plan. She was pushing him, trying to get under his skin, and for a moment, he felt exposed. But he couldn't let her see that. "No, Barbara. It's nothing personal," he said smoothly. "I've just been busy. You know how things are at the top. There's always something that needs my attention." But even as he said the words, he knew they didn't ring entirely true. There was a part of him, something raw and unspoken, that had been growing ever since he started working with her. He had spent so much time focusing on revenge that he had forgotten to truly see the woman in front of him. Barbara didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "All right, if you say so." The conversation shifted back to business, but the air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Richard couldn't help but notice the tension in Barbara's posture, the way her eyes lingered on him for just a moment longer than necessary. Had she sensed something? Or was she just probing, trying to figure him out as he had been trying to figure her out? The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of numbers and projections. Richard was still reeling from the conversation, his thoughts scattered. He had never felt this unsettled before. Barbara was far too perceptive for her own good. She was getting too close to the truth, and that terrified him. As Barbara left his office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, Richard sat back in his chair, running his fingers through his hair. He needed to regain control. He couldn't allow this distraction to interfere with his ultimate goal. Revenge was still his top priority, but something inside him nagged at him. Was he truly in control? Or had he underestimated Barbara in ways that would ultimately destroy him? The weeks passed in a haze of meetings, reports, and calculated interactions. Richard had worked hard to maintain the illusion of control, but the truth was starting to settle like a weight on his chest. Barbara was always there, professional and composed, but there were moments in the quiet, fleeting seconds between them when he could see past her polished exterior. She was starting to suspect something, and that was something Richard had not planned for. He had set out with a clear purpose: to destroy her mother, to bring the woman who had ruined his family to her knees. But now, with Barbara in the equation, things had shifted. Richard had thought he could manipulate Barbara into unknowingly helping him. But every move he made to keep her in the dark only seemed to draw her closer, like a moth to a flame. At first, it had been a game, seduction mixed with strategy, a careful dance where he pulled the strings and she followed. But with every interaction, every piercing glance, every word of reassurance he gave her, he found himself more drawn to her than he had intended. Barbara was perceptive, yes. But there was something deeper than that. She was different. Unlike anyone he had ever encountered before. Her ability to read between the lines, to see past the veneer of power and wealth that Richard had built around himself, made her both infuriating and captivating. She had become a force he didn't know how to control, and for the first time in his life, Richard Montgomery was uncertain. It was a late afternoon when everything began to unravel. The usual hum of the office was quieter than normal, with most employees having gone home. Richard sat in his office, papers scattered in front of him, his mind a swirling mess of thoughts. He had been going over financial projections and strategic reports for hours, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Barbara. She had been distant lately, and Richard couldn't help but wonder if his own distance had caused it. He had made a decision earlier that day. He would confront her. The time had come. No more dancing around the subject. He needed to know where they stood. Was she just another obstacle to his goal? Or was she something more, something he couldn't yet define? Just as he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his thoughts. A message from Barbara. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to discuss the client feedback on the upcoming project. I'm available in 15 minutes if you'd like to meet." Richard hesitated for a moment. He had known this moment was coming, but seeing her name on the screen made him pause. He wasn't ready for what he had planned, but he couldn't back down now. He had to face her, confront the tension between them, and force the truth out of himself. "I'll meet you in my office. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He stood up from his desk, straightening his suit jacket as he prepared for their meeting. As he moved across the room to adjust his tie, a sense of foreboding crept over him. What if this wasn't just a conversation about business? What if she had figured it all out? Moments later, there was a knock at the door. Richard opened it to find Barbara standing in the doorway, her posture as professional as ever, but her eyes betrayed something more. There was a weight to her gaze, something that had been absent before. She was no longer just his secretary. She had become a force in her own right. "Good afternoon, Mr. Montgomery," Barbara said, her voice steady. There was a slight hesitation in her tone, something Richard couldn't place, but it made him uneasy. "Barbara," Richard replied, gesturing for her to enter. "Please have a seat." She stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two of them alone in the dimly lit office. Richard couldn't ignore the palpable tension between them. Every time Barbara spoke, it was as though she was probing deeper, asking more questions with her words than the ones she actually spoke. Barbara sat down across from him, her hands clasped in her lap, and met his gaze with an intensity that made Richard feel exposed. The space between them felt charged, thick with unspoken words. This wasn't just a business discussion. Richard could feel it. "I've been reviewing the latest feedback from our clients, and I think there are some red flags we need to address," Barbara said, diving straight into business. But Richard could tell she wasn't here just to talk about reports. There was something else she wanted to say. Something she needed to get off her chest. "Of course," Richard replied, leaning forward. He forced his voice to remain neutral, but he could feel the weight of the conversation shifting. He had no idea what was coming, but he had the distinct feeling that this meeting wasn't going to end the way he'd planned. Barbara continued, her eyes never leaving his. "But it's not just the clients I've been concerned about." Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge to it. "I've been thinking about something else. About you. About everything that's been happening between us." Richard's pulse quickened. He kept his expression unreadable, though his mind raced. Was she aware of what he had been planning? Was this the moment she would confront him? Would she expose his motives for revenge? "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice carefully composed, as he maintained his cool facade. "What do you mean, Barbara?" Barbara's gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the intensity of her words. "Richard, I've been working for you for a while now. I've always been your assistant, but lately it feels like there's more going on than just business. I'm not blind. I can tell something's not right. You're hiding something from me." Richard was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to respond, how to keep control of the situation. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and he could feel it. His plan, his entire scheme, was beginning to unravel, and he wasn't sure if he could stop it. Barbara's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. I know there's something between us, Richard. But I also know there's something you're not telling me. I don't know if it's personal or professional, but whatever it is, I need to know. I deserve the truth. Richard's throat tightened. He had spent so much time carefully constructing his facade, but now, faced with Barbara's unwavering gaze, the truth felt closer than ever before. He had been so focused on his revenge, so obsessed with the idea of destroying her mother, that he had never stopped to consider the cost. The cost to his own heart. The cost to his humanity. What if the truth isn't something you want to hear? Richard finally said, his voice barely a whisper. What if it shatters everything? Barbara didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze with quiet resolve. I'd rather know the truth than live with the lies. Richard inhaled sharply, his mind teetering on the edge of something he couldn't control. For the first time, he felt like the hunter had become the hunted. Barbara was no longer just a part of his plan. She had become the catalyst for his undoing. I'm not who you think I am, Barbara, Richard said, his voice laced with raw honesty. And neither are you. Barbara's eyes softened. I never expected you to be perfect, Richard. I want to understand. I want to know why things between us feel so complicated. Why I'm starting to care about you when I know I shouldn't. There it was, the truth. It had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Richard had been lying to himself, hiding his own feelings behind the armor of his revenge plot. But now, in the face of Barbara's vulnerability, he realized that he had let himself care. And that was a weakness he couldn't afford. I never wanted you to get involved in this, Barbara, Richard said, his voice filled with a mix of regret and guilt. But I'm already too far in. And now you're a part of it, whether you like it or not. Barbara's eyes darkened, the weight of his words settling in. A part of what, Richard? What exactly is going on here? Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had come so far, too far to turn back now. And yet, with Barbara staring at him, with her gaze full of truth, he realized something he hadn't been willing to admit before. He was losing control. The silence that fell between Richard and Barbara felt heavier than ever before. The words he had spoken, the confessions and half-truths, seemed to hang in the air, pressing on him with the weight of their meaning. For so long, Richard had built walls around his heart, around his mind, using power and control as his shield. But now, with Barbara's unwavering gaze fixed upon him, those walls were beginning to crumble. The truth of his intentions had been spoken, but only in fragments. His desire for revenge against her mother, the woman who had torn apart his family, still burned hot inside him. It was what had driven him for years. Yet now, the woman he had once seen only as a tool in his grand plan was staring at him with those piercing eyes, forcing him to face something he hadn't anticipated, his own vulnerability. Barbara wasn't just a secretary anymore. She wasn't just a pawn in his twisted game. She was a person with her own desires, her own complexities, and her own strengths. The realization came too late, and Richard had no idea how to react to it. The emotions he had tried so hard to suppress began to bubble to the surface, and for a brief moment, he felt out of control. And that was a feeling he had never liked. Barbara broke the silence first, her voice low but firm. Richard, you don't have to protect me from the truth. I deserve to know what's going on. I deserve to know who you really are. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers gripping the edge of the desk. It felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He had always been so sure of himself, of his ability to manipulate situations, to bend them to his will. But here, with Barbara sitting across from him, the pieces of his carefully constructed world felt like they were falling apart. You don't understand, Richard said, his voice tight. This isn't about you. It was never about you. It's about her. About your mother. Barbara's eyes widened slightly, the tension in her features becoming palpable. My mother? She repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. What do you mean by that? Richard felt a pang of guilt, but he shoved it aside. This was not the time for weakness. He had already come this far. He couldn't back down now, even if the truth would tear him apart. Your mother, Richard said again, his voice rising slightly. She destroyed my family. My father was a good man. He didn't deserve what she did to him. She seduced him, took everything from us, and left us to pick up the pieces. I lost everything because of her. Barbara was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Her lips parted, as if she were about to say something, but she hesitated, as if weighing the gravity of his words. The room was so quiet that Richard could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. I'm sorry about your father, Barbara finally said, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it. But that doesn't explain why you've been using me. Why you've treated me like a tool in some sick revenge plot. Richard felt a sharp sting in his chest at her words, but he refused to let it show. He had spent years hiding his pain, his anger, and this wasn't the time to unravel completely. I didn't want this to happen, Richard muttered more to himself than to her. I didn't want to care about you. I told myself it was just business. But the truth is, I don't know how to stop this anymore. Barbara stared at him, her eyes narrowing. Stop what? Richard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Stop feeling. I told myself I'd use you to get to your mother, to make her pay for what she did to my family. I thought that was all I needed, revenge. But it's not enough anymore. I don't know how to undo this, whatever this is between us. Barbara's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. You don't get to use me, Richard. You don't get to manipulate me because of your hatred for my mother. I'm not her. I know you're not her, Richard said quickly, his tone softer now. But I've been playing a game, and I didn't realize. I was losing myself in it. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have dragged you into this. Barbara stood up suddenly, her chair scraping across the floor. She turned away from him, staring out the window for a long time. The silence between them grew heavy again, but this time, it wasn't just the weight of his confession. It was the uncertainty of what came next. Richard had broken something between them, something fragile. And he wasn't sure if it could be fixed. Finally, Barbara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you want from me, Richard. But I need to know that I can trust you. That you're not just using me to get back at my mother. I'm not, Richard said, though doubt lingered in his words. I swear to you, Barbara. I never wanted to hurt you. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and frustration. Then why did you keep me at arm's length for so long? Why didn't you trust me? Richard closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Because I was afraid, he admitted quietly. Afraid that if I let you in, you'd see the truth. The truth about me, about why I've been doing this. And I didn't want to lose control. Barbara's expression softened, but there was still an air of distance between them, something that couldn't be ignored. It's not about control, Richard. It's about trust. And right now, I'm not sure I can trust you. Richard felt a pang of regret, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had spent so long controlling every aspect of his life, so long holding on to his anger and his need for vengeance, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly trust someone. He had pushed Barbara away because he didn't know how to open himself up, how to allow someone in without risking everything. The silence stretched on, but this time, it was not as oppressive. There was a sense of mutual understanding beginning to form, however fragile. Richard knew that he had to do something to fix what he had broken, but the question was, could he? I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back, Barbara, Richard said, his voice quiet but resolute. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to make things right. Barbara didn't respond immediately. She stood there, staring at him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she nodded, though her expression was still guarded. I don't know if I can believe you right now, she said softly. But I'll give you a chance to prove it. Richard nodded, feeling a small weight lift off his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road he had to walk, whether he liked it or not. The game had changed, and so had he. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was no longer in control. And maybe that was a good thing. The days following that fateful conversation felt like a slow-moving storm. Richard couldn't shake the image of Barbara's face as she turned away from him in his office, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and doubt. He had always been able to control the narrative, to twist situations to his advantage. But with Barbara, nothing seemed predictable anymore. Every interaction, every glance, felt like a carefully calculated move in a game he no longer understood. As the week wore on, Richard tried to focus on work, trying to distract himself from the gnawing feeling of guilt that seemed to grow inside him every time he saw Barbara. She had been quieter than usual, her interactions with him professional but distant. He knew that she was giving him space, but the silence was unbearable. It was like walking on a tightrope, with every step precarious, unsure of whether he would fall or finally find some semblance of balance. Richard's thoughts were interrupted one afternoon when his phone buzzed with a message from Barbara. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it, already anticipating the worst. "Mr. Montgomery, we need to talk. I think it's time we discuss things more openly. Please meet me in my office at 4 p.m. today." His stomach tightened. Was this the moment when everything would come crashing down? Would she finally tell him that it was over, that she couldn't trust him anymore? The thought made him feel uneasy, but he knew he had no choice but to face it. He couldn't avoid this conversation forever. At 3:55 p.m., Richard made his way down the hallway to Barbara's office. As he approached her door, he could hear the sound of her typing away on her keyboard, the soft tapping of keys, a stark contrast to the heavy tension that seemed to hang in the air between them. He knocked gently, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet office. Barbara didn't look up immediately, but when she did, her expression was unreadable. She gestured for him to enter, her movements stiff, as if she was forcing herself to be calm. Richard stepped inside, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him like a thick fog. "Sit down, Richard," Barbara said softly, her voice lacking the usual warmth. "We need to talk." He did as she asked, sitting across from her in one of the chairs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, until Barbara broke it with a quiet sigh. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, her gaze fixed on the desk in front of her. "About your father, about my mother, about everything that's happened. And I need to be honest with you." Richard's heart began to race, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. Was she going to confess that she knew everything about his plan, about his scheme for revenge? Was she finally going to confront him for what he had done? "I don't know if I can forgive you, Richard," Barbara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever forget what you've done. But I need to understand. I need to know why." Her words hit him harder than any slap could have. The weight of her disappointment, the pain in her eyes, was almost too much to bear. He had been so focused on his own feelings of betrayal, on his need for revenge, that he had never stopped to think about the damage he was causing to the person sitting in front of him. "I did what I did because I was angry," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with a raw honesty he hadn't shown in years. "I was angry at your mother for what she did to my family, for what she took from me. I wanted to make her feel what I felt. I thought using you would get me the revenge I needed." Barbara's eyes flickered with something, perhaps understanding, perhaps something deeper, but she didn't interrupt him. Instead, she sat there, watching him, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't expect to feel this way," Richard continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't expect to care about you. I didn't expect you to get under my skin. But now everything feels like it's spinning out of control. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to fix this." Barbara leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "I don't know if it can be fixed, Richard. What you've done, it's not something that just goes away. But I need to know that you're not just going to keep using me as a means to an end. That you're not going to keep hiding behind your anger." Richard swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. The truth was, he didn't know how to stop using people. He had spent so much of his life manipulating others, getting what he wanted by any means necessary, that he had forgotten what it was like to be truly vulnerable, to let someone in without ulterior motives. "I don't want to use you anymore," Richard said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to drag you into this. I don't know how to make things right." Barbara's eyes softened as she studied him. "I can't make that decision for you, Richard. But I can't keep living in this limbo. I need to know if we're going to move forward or if this is where it ends." For a long moment, Richard didn't speak. He wanted to say something, anything that would make the situation right, but the words felt like they were stuck in his throat. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he had never meant for things to go this far, but he wasn't sure if Barbara would believe him. Finally, he spoke. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect. I can't promise that I'll be able to fix everything I've broken. But I can promise that I'll try. I'll try to make it right with you. I'll try to stop hiding behind my anger." Barbara didn't say anything for a while. Instead, she simply looked at him, her gaze steady, unyielding. Richard could feel the weight of her judgment, the sense that she was waiting for something. For him to prove that he was worth trusting, worth caring about. "I can't just forgive you because you say you'll try," Barbara said finally. "But I'll give you a chance. I'll give you the chance to show me that you mean it. But you have to understand, Richard, that it's not just about what you say. It's about what you do." Richard nodded, a feeling of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew that earning her trust wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and most of all, honesty. "I understand," Richard said quietly. "And I'll do whatever it takes." Barbara studied him for a moment longer before standing up. "I hope you do, Richard. I really do." Richard watched as she walked to the door, her movements graceful yet determined. He knew that he had a long road ahead of him, a road that would test him in ways he hadn't imagined. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. But he knew that the price of redemption would be higher than anything he had ever paid before. As the door closed behind her, Richard sat in the silence of her office, his mind racing. He had just taken the first step on a path that would lead him somewhere he couldn't yet see. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the edge of something new, something real. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't turn back. The days after their conversation in Barbara's office felt like they had both stepped into an uncertain future. There were no immediate answers, no promises that things would change overnight. Instead, the quiet space between them was filled with tentative steps, small, careful moves towards something that neither of them could define yet. Richard tried, in his own way, to honor Barbara's request for him to prove his sincerity. He focused on the work at hand, ensuring that the business projects they had been working on together were running smoothly. But despite his outward composure, he couldn't shake the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest every time their eyes met. Barbara was different now. Her gaze was colder, more reserved, and even though she no longer looked at him with contempt, there was something unmistakable in the way she interacted with him, like a fragile piece hanging in the balance. Barbara, too, felt the weight of the unspoken between them. She had given him a chance, more of a chance than he probably deserved, but she couldn't help but wonder if her decision had been impulsive. Was it too soon to trust him again? Could she really forgive him for everything he had done to her, even if he appeared to be changing before her eyes? It was a precarious game they were both playing, one where each move could tip the balance, sending them back to the place where trust was nothing but a distant memory. One late afternoon, the tension reached a new boiling point. Barbara was at her desk, reviewing some documents for an upcoming meeting, when Richard entered her office. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, a sound that felt too loud for the otherwise quiet space. She didn't look up at first, and for a moment, Richard stood there, uncertain of whether he should speak or wait for her to acknowledge him. The silence between them seemed to press against him like a physical weight. "Barbara," Richard said, his voice breaking the stillness. "Can we talk?" She looked up then, her eyes cool but unreadable. For a second, Richard thought he saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or maybe doubt, but it was gone too quickly for him to identify. "What is it?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Richard could tell that she was holding something back. He'd seen this before, the way she put up walls, carefully concealing her emotions. He had done it for years, but now, it felt different, more painful, like a reminder of everything he had lost in his pursuit of revenge. "I need to explain something," Richard said, stepping further into the room, his gaze steady. "About my father, and about what I did." Barbara raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. "I thought we'd already talked about that." "I know," he replied. "But there's more to it. Something I didn't tell you, something I haven't shared with anyone." Barbara's expression softened ever so slightly, a sign that her guard might be lowering just a fraction. But she didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. Richard hesitated. The weight of the confession he was about to make pressed on him more heavily than anything he had ever felt. He had lived with the guilt of his actions for so long, but revealing the truth felt like tearing open an old wound. "My father wasn't just a victim," Richard began, his voice quieter now. "He was complicit in everything. He knew what your mother was doing, and he allowed it to happen. He thought that he could control her, that he could somehow tame her. But in the end, he lost everything. And when he died, I didn't just lose a father. I lost everything. The company, my family's reputation, it all came crashing down because of his choices. And I blamed her. I blamed your mother." Barbara's eyes widened, and for the first time, Richard saw a flicker of something genuine in her, surprise, perhaps even shock. She uncrossed her arms and sat up straighter, leaning toward him. "So, you're saying your father was just as much to blame as my mother?" Richard nodded, the weight of the truth heavy in his chest. "Yes. He was just as guilty as she was. He let it all happen because he thought he could control her. And when it all fell apart, he died with the consequences of his decisions. I spent years hating your mother for what she did, but now I realize that my father was just as responsible." Barbara didn't speak right away. She sat back in her chair, digesting his words. Richard watched her closely, searching her face for any sign of what she was thinking. Was she angry? Disappointed? Or was she beginning to understand? For what felt like an eternity, Barbara remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor as she processed everything Richard had just confessed. The minutes ticked by, and Richard began to feel the familiar unease creeping back in. Had he gone too far? Was this just another revelation that would push her away? Finally, Barbara lifted her gaze to meet his. Her expression was calm, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something that hinted at the turmoil swirling beneath the surface. "So all of this," she said, her voice steady. "All of it, the manipulation, the lies, the games, this was all because of your father?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. Her words weren't accusatory, but they felt like a challenge. She was asking him to take full responsibility for what he had done, and for the first time, he realized that he couldn't blame anyone else, not his father, not her mother. He had to own his actions. He had to face the reality that he had been just as much a part of the destruction as anyone else. "Yes," Richard admitted quietly. "I was so consumed by my anger, by my need to make someone pay, that I didn't stop to think about the consequences. I didn't stop to think about how it would affect you." Barbara's expression softened, but only slightly. "I appreciate the honesty, Richard. I really do. But that doesn't change everything that's happened." Richard nodded. He understood. Nothing could erase the past, not really. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could start to rebuild from here. Start with the truth, even if it was painful. Start with acknowledging that he was not the victim he had made himself out to be for so long. "I know," Richard said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, not right away. But I needed to tell you the truth. Because if we're going to move forward, if we're going to have any chance of fixing this, I need to be honest with you about everything." Barbara regarded him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps something deeper that she had yet to see. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with a quiet resolve. "I'm not sure where this will go, Richard," Barbara said softly. "I don't know if we can move past all of this. But I'm willing to try. Because right now, that's all I can give you, the chance to try." Richard felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the understanding that this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, and trust could not be rebuilt in a day. It would take time. It would take effort. And it would take something more, something he wasn't sure he had left to give, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, and it was enough to keep him moving forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he couldn't go back. And he didn't want to. The weeks that followed Richard's confession were filled with tension, but also with a quiet sense of change. Richard could feel the subtle shift in his own heart, as if the very fabric of his soul was being rewoven with threads of honesty, regret, and hope. He was trying, truly trying to change. But whether that would be enough for Barbara, whether it could undo the damage he had done, was something he didn't yet know. Barbara, too, was caught in a battle within herself. She had given him a chance, something she had never thought possible after everything he had put her through. But as the days passed, she couldn't help but wonder if her decision had been hasty. Was she simply indulging a moment of weakness? Or had she really seen a shift in Richard, something she could believe in? Her mind was torn between the man who had deceived her, manipulated her into an unthinkable relationship for revenge, and the man who, for the first time, seemed to be speaking the truth. Every day, they interacted with a new understanding, a new tension between them. They had become somewhat of a fragile alliance, tethered together by the thinnest of threads. They would meet in the office, their eyes occasionally meeting, as if testing the waters for something deeper, something they weren't sure was still possible. Richard, despite his attempts to show her he was different, found himself more confused than ever. He had given Barbara the truth, but was it enough to make her stay? It wasn't just their relationship that was at stake. There were other forces at play, forces that both Richard and Barbara had been trying to avoid. The whispers in the office, the questions from their colleagues, the growing sense of tension in the business world, they were all part of a larger narrative they couldn't ignore. Richard knew that his motives for seeking revenge against Barbara's mother had left a permanent stain on the company's reputation. The media was beginning to take notice, and the pressure was mounting. The cracks in Richard's life weren't just emotional anymore, they were professional too. His actions, once fueled by anger, had set off a chain reaction that was beginning to threaten everything he had worked for. It was on one particularly cold Thursday afternoon, as Richard sat in his penthouse, staring out over the city, that his thoughts finally reached a breaking point. He had done everything he could think of to salvage his relationship with Barbara, but the weight of his past actions still hung over him. He couldn't outrun it. The guilt gnawed at him, eating away at the core of his being. The feeling of betrayal, not just against Barbara but also against himself, felt suffocating. He needed to do something to make it right, not just for Barbara, but for him too. Richard called Barbara's office, his fingers lingering over the phone before he made the call. He had done everything wrong up to this point, but maybe, just maybe, this was his last chance to prove that he wasn't beyond redemption. "Barbara," he said when she picked up. His voice was steady but laced with something deeper, a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. "I need to see you. Now. Can you meet me at my place?" There was a long pause on the other end, and Richard could almost hear her weighing her options, the familiar uncertainty lingering in the air between them. Finally, she responded, her voice calm but guarded. "All right. I'll be there in an hour." An hour. That was all he had. Richard sat down on the edge of his couch, his mind racing. What could he say? How could he fix what had been broken? His attempts to apologize had never felt enough, and now, the pressure of everything else, his father's legacy, Barbara's mother's betrayal, the reputation of the company, seemed to close in on him. By the time Barbara arrived, the apartment felt colder than usual. Richard was pacing the room when he heard the soft knock on the door. He straightened up, trying to compose himself before opening it. Barbara stood in the doorway, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She stepped inside without a word, closing the door softly behind her. Richard could see the change in her too. The spark of hope that had briefly appeared in her eyes after their last conversation had dimmed. Her posture was stiff, guarded, and her face showed no signs of warmth, no signs of the trust she had once given him so freely. "I don't know what you expect from me, Richard," Barbara began, her voice steady but sharp. "You've apologized 1,000 times. You've given me your version of the truth. But what does it all mean? I'm still standing here with a heart that doesn't know whether to forgive you or walk away from everything we've built." Richard's heart thudded in his chest as he listened to her words. He had never been good at this, at emotions, at honesty, at vulnerability. But he knew this was it. This was his last chance to show her he could change, that he wasn't the man he used to be. "I know I've hurt you, Barbara," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I've done things that I can never take back. But I've spent every day since then trying to fix it, trying to fix myself. I know I can't change the past, but I'm asking you to let me show you who I am now. Not the man who sought revenge, not the man who used you, but the man who's learned something from all of this." Barbara's gaze softened just a fraction, but it wasn't enough to give him hope. She crossed her arms over her chest, still unsure. "What makes you think you've changed, Richard? What makes you think that this isn't just another attempt to manipulate me?" Richard looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "Because I'm not asking you for anything anymore. I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking for a chance, just one more chance to show you that I can be better. That I am better." Barbara was silent for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his. The air between them felt charged, and the weight of their past mistakes hung like a shadow in the room. "I don't know if I can give you that chance," Barbara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything you've done. Not after everything you've put me through." Richard felt his heart drop, but he forced himself to remain steady. "I understand. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't move forward if I don't try. And I can't move forward without you." Barbara's eyes softened, but only just. She looked away for a moment, as if searching for something within herself. Richard waited, breathless, for her to make a decision. He knew that whatever she decided would determine the future of everything. After what seemed like an eternity, Barbara looked back at him, her gaze steady. "I'm not saying yes, Richard. I'm not saying no. But I'm willing to see what happens. If you're serious about changing, then prove it. Not with words, but with actions." Richard nodded, relief flooding through him. It wasn't a yes, but it was more than he had expected. It was a glimmer of hope, the smallest sliver of light that could lead to something more. "I will," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I will prove it to you." Barbara stepped back toward the door, her eyes still locked on his. "I hope you do, Richard. Because if this is just another game, I won't be here for it." As she left, Richard stood there, the weight of her words sinking deep into him. He had one chance, just one, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The city buzzed outside Richard's penthouse, the streets alive with the hum of cars, the rush of people, the never-ending motion of life that seemed to continue no matter what personal storms brewed inside the walls of his apartment. But Richard was still, his thoughts swirling, locked in the moment that had arrived with the quiet certainty of dawn. This was it, the moment of truth, the culmination of everything that had led him here, to this point, with Barbara. Her words echoed in his mind. Prove it with actions, not words. It had been the simplest of requests, but one that demanded everything from him. Words, however heartfelt, were not enough. She wanted to see that he was different, changed not by what he said, but by what he did, by what he had become since the truth had been laid bare. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of reflection, understanding, and regret. Richard had spent sleepless nights thinking about his actions, the revenge, the manipulation, the betrayals. He had lied to himself for so long, convincing himself that he was justified, that the hurt he caused was a necessary means to an end. But now, looking back, he saw the consequences in full: the destruction of relationships, the shattering of his own soul, and the irreparable damage to the woman who had once been his closest confidant, and yes, his greatest vulnerability. Barbara was right to be cautious, to guard her heart. He had done unspeakable things to her. Yet, after everything, she had given him something many never would: a second chance. A chance not because she believed he was worth it, but because she believed in the possibility of change. And so, Richard stood in the silence of his apartment, the weight of the world on his shoulders, knowing that if he were to save himself, and her, he had to make the right choice. No more games. No more excuses. He needed to show her, through every action, through every decision, that he was the man he claimed to be now. A man capable of love. A man who could understand the importance of trust, of forgiveness, and of starting anew. Barbara's mind had been racing as well. The decision to meet Richard had not come lightly. She had spent the last few days in a whirlwind of emotion, trying to understand her own heart, whether she was still capable of trusting him, whether the damage done could be undone by a few months of self-reflection and promises. Part of her wanted to walk away, to cut the ties, to never look back at a man who had caused her so much pain. But another part of her, the part she didn't quite understand, wanted to see if there was a way forward, if the man standing before her now was truly someone she could build a future with. She arrived at Richard's penthouse, stepping out of the elevator and into the plush, minimalist space that had once been a symbol of his arrogance. Now, it felt different. Quieter, more solemn. As if, somehow, the space reflected his own internal transformation. She hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door, her pulse quickening. There was so much at stake in this meeting. Not just for them, but for the lives they had built around each other, for the fragile trust that could either heal or shatter with a single word. When Richard opened the door, his face was a mix of nervous anticipation and raw sincerity. He didn't try to hide it. His eyes were wide, his expression open, as if he had finally come to terms with the man he was now. He was no longer the cold, calculating millionaire bent on revenge. He was someone who had learned the hard way what it meant to lose everything: his family, his company, and the woman he loved. "Barbara," he said quietly, his voice laden with emotion. "Thank you for coming. I know I don't deserve this moment, but I had to see you again. I had to show you that I can change." Barbara took a slow breath, studying him carefully. She wasn't sure what to expect, whether he had truly changed or if this was just another performance. But there was something in his gaze, something unspoken, that told her he meant it. For once, she could see the man he had become. He wasn't asking her for forgiveness, and he wasn't pleading for her love. He was simply asking for a chance. "Let's talk," she said, her voice steady, but her heart pounding in her chest. They sat in the living room, the low hum of the city outside mingling with the silence between them. Richard had been the one to speak first, but this time, Barbara took the lead. "I've thought a lot about what you said," she began. "And about what you did. The truth is, Richard, I don't know if I can forgive everything. I don't know if I'll ever truly forget the hurt you caused me. But what I do know is that I'm not the same person I was when we first met. I've changed too." Richard's eyes never left hers. He listened intently, as though this moment was the final test, the one that would define their future. He nodded slowly, understanding that the truth was not as simple as a confession. Forgiveness was earned through actions, not words. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "We've both changed. But I want you to know that I'm not the man I was when I first manipulated you. I've spent every day since then trying to be better, not just for you, but for myself. I won't ask you to forgive me. Not yet. But I need you to know that I'm different now." Barbara looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, maybe reassurance, maybe clarity, but in that moment, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just about him. It was about her too. It was about moving forward, not with the weight of the past constantly looming over her, but with the understanding that she could choose how to react to it. She had the power to heal. "I don't have all the answers," Barbara said softly, her voice steady. But I know one thing. I want a future that isn't built on lies. I want to believe in us again, but it's going to take time. You're right about that. But I can't do this if I'm still holding on to the anger. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He had been prepared for this moment, but hearing her words, so clear, so honest, made his heart swell with emotion. He had never wanted to hurt her. He had never wanted to be the cause of her pain. And now, here they were, both standing at the crossroads of their lives, unsure of the future but determined to walk it together. I can wait, Richard said quietly. I'll wait for as long as it takes. I'll prove to you that I'm worth your trust. And I'll be here, every step of the way, whenever you're ready. Barbara nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It was a fragile smile, but it was a start. I'm not saying it will be easy, she replied. But I'm willing to try. For us. And so, for the first time in what felt like forever, Richard felt the chains of guilt that had bound him for so long begin to loosen. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was a path they could walk together, with the understanding that the road to redemption was long, but it was still worth taking.